Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We'll just let the participants float in here over the next few minutes. So, Donnie, if you would like to do a drum solo while we wait, you're welcome to do that. But in the meantime, we'll just let everybody find their way in here, and then we'll do some introductions and get started.
Yeah, Neil Peart, Canadian, was the drummer of Rush, and before he passed on, he taught me everything he knew. So I have the whole repertoire just memorized.
Rush, one of the more influential bands of all time.
Yes, yes.
The, 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 the progressive rock.
I was showing my kids the other day his drum solos, and literally he has this drum set that's 360 degrees all around him. So he would play here and then just keep turning his chair and just go all the way around.
For sure. Incredible. One more minute and then we're going to get started. For the participants, feel free as we discuss a variety of questions and topics to really write in any questions that you might have. You can direct them specifically to any of the panelists here as well. We'll try to pick them up in a free flow type of way and answer them as they come in. So we'll try to keep it as light as possible and free flowing. But if you do have questions or you'd like a little bit more information specifically on a topic that we're discussing, don't hesitate to jump in there. Okay, let's get started. Thanks everybody for joining. I think this is the 4th or 5th installment of the Kili webinar series where we try to explore and examine a variety of topics that are top of mind for all of us. Unless you've been living under a rock over the last number of years, blockchain, tokens, cryptocurrencies, etc., have been growing in prominence. Today we have a number of people, a number of experts on the panel who have their hands in this ecosystem and can provide a lot of visibility specifically on its impact and influence on the marketing and advertising ecosystem. So with that in mind, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Brian, then Carolina, then Shaylee, and then Donnie, and then we'll get into the content. So Brian, maybe a little bit about you and what you're working on as a company and where your place is in the blockchain as a starting point.
Perfect, thanks Neil. Yeah, so I'm Brian Cox. I'm the general manager for Mazra, which is Kochava's distributed ledger technology. Interestingly, I've spent the last 2 years at Kochava running the Collective, which is Kochava's data marketplace business. So I've seen a lot of the evolution of consent and identity as we've gone through GDPR, CCPA, ATT, and others, and how we're kind of transitioning that along toward a blockchain distributed ledger technology solution.
Hello, I'm Carolina Benante. I'm the co-founder for NYIAX. NYIAX is a contract management exchange powered by NASDAQ. We bring buyers and sellers together to trade in a transparent methodology. We use blockchain as our core ledger, and in the last several years with CCPA, CPRA, with also all of the different privacy legislations and rules, we place that into our order books that's then placed into the blockchain as well. And I'm very excited about this program.
Hi, I'm Shelly Singh. I'm the head of product at IAB Tech Lab, and we work on foundational technologies to support the growth and trust in digital media industry. Specifically on blockchain, we started a working group way back in 2017, and it was an overwhelming response. Like it's still the largest working group in terms of individual membership. We've been focused on mainly on the education about the technology with primers and other details. And lately, we renamed the working group to DLT for distributed ledger technologies, cryptography, and emerging concepts, so that we can look at a more comprehensive view on the technology and see how we can use different aspects of the blockchain technology and application of it to advertising.
Great. And my name is Donnie Devorin. I'm currently head of sales, or specifically head of advertising sales at Brave. If you're unfamiliar with Brave, we are a browser that goes head to head with the likes of Chrome and other browsers out there. Interestingly, this week we launched a search engine. So we're a browser and a search engine all in one, which is exciting news for us. And I recommend everybody the easiest way to find out or to understand Brave is just to go to brave.com and download it and start using it. And it's really easy to import your bookmarks. And I like to explain Brave in two parts, from a user side and also from a business side. So from a user side, it's a browser that protects your privacy. It's super duper fast because it takes out all of the trackers and pixels and third-party cookies that track you. So there's that big privacy element to it. And when you take out all of the trackers, it becomes very fast to use it. And it also blocks out all of the display ads and all of the YouTube ads. So it's really like this great ad-free experience with a browser that's really fast. And then from the advertising side, there is an opportunity to opt in to advertising. And that's the advertising that my team sells. There's push notifications and these sponsored images. And as a user, you can get rewarded for your attention. So just like you would fly Delta or American Airlines and rack up points, you would use the Brave browser, see ads, and rack up something called basic attention tokens. And we can get into that, but that's basically the first entree into why we're using blockchain and cryptocurrencies for that payment portion of rewarding users for when they see ads.
Great. And if you don't know me, I'm Neil Sweeney. I'm the CEO and founder of Kili. It's a publicly traded company, trades under the symbol MyID. At Kili, our philosophy really is trying to democratize data specifically for consumers, provide them access to the data that is currently being collected and used. If you go to Kili today and you put in an identifier, validate you are who you say you are, really for the first time ever, you can unveil the data that's been historically collected and sold without your permission. We're really trying to put that access and control back into the consumer's hands to give them the optionality to decide what they then like to do. So now that everybody's done the introduction, one thing I wanted to really get to the heart of, and let's just deal with it kind of right off the hop, is, you know, the title of this webinar has been, is blockchain and privacy on a collision course? There inherently seems to be tenets of the chain and privacy that overlap. Knowing that everybody here has obviously got their hands in this, just maybe let's do a roundtable starting here with Carolina as to, do you believe that blockchain and privacy are on a collision course? If so, how? And if not, maybe why?
I think that it will be in the future. Currently, I'm not seeing that as much yet, but I think within the next year, we're going to start seeing a collision course of that. We see the rise of the clean rooms and data being disseminated, more legislation that's coming up. And actually, individuals want to own their data and how they're going to be displayed their data. And I think that this is going to impact how we're going to utilize blockchain and how that data is going to come in, whether it's going to come in through third-party sources or through rails that will come into how we utilize it. I think that is something that is coming to fruition in the next year.
Shayla, do you have a comment on that topic as well?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same camp as Carolina, I think, for multiple reasons. One is that when you look at privacy and the companies that have to comply with those privacy regulations, they will usually tend to rely on tried and tested technologies. And that's kind of one of the reasons why they would not jump onto something as new as blockchain. The second reason is that of the identity of the consumer itself. Unless like big platforms or something new where users actually go to get content and get value, unless they introduce a decentralized ID, till then I think you won't see all the data and privacy going to blockchain.
Donnie?
Yeah, I'll answer the question more from a user, consumer, person angle, I think that there's something inherent about the crypto buyer, or the privacy person, and that privacy person and someone who's interested in crypto or blockchain are very much the same. It goes back many years, and there are privacy coins out there like a Monero or a Zcash. And speaking more from Brave, Brave is the privacy browser. And when we look at our user base, over 70% of our users trade or own cryptocurrencies at this time. So you have these people that really care about their privacy, and they're really into crypto / blockchain. And I know they're different, and I'm using them interchangeably, but cryptocurrencies use blockchain and DLT technology. So I think that they, of course, you can have privacy without blockchain, and you can have blockchain without privacy. But I think Brave is a good example of how they kind of mesh into one, all in one package.
You can come back to a couple of the things there, but I wanted to get Brian's feedback first before we maybe circle back on a couple of these thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I tend to agree. I think these things are becoming more mainstream. We've stopped talking blockchain, kind of a year and a half, 2 years ago. And for us, it's really all about the underlying technology, right? The distributed ledger technology just brings tenets of advancement that make these solutions better, more accommodating across the platform. DLT continues to be a really large interest at Kochava because of this, the transactional ledger, permission privacy, immutability, all of that. And I think that because of the kind of ability of this technology to accommodate a wider swath, that this is on a collision. I agree, it's not going to happen, next month or end of this year, but I think it's moving that way. If you think about identity, you can't have, consent is tied to identity, right? You can't have a valid identity without a valid consent. And I think that, distributed ledger technology starts to put that consent, auditability, immutability into the hands of the people that really will drive the ultimate solution for, having the power where it belongs.
So with this, for those of you that are not familiar with Kili, we started on the blockchain where we were encrypting data directly on the device and then storing the record of transaction on the blockchain. So we've kind of been there, done that. Some of the comments that Carolina and others have brought up, and I'd like to get some feedback from the group here. It seems as though the group is saying it is on a collision course, but it's not going to happen now. And what are the bottlenecks that need to be removed? What we found internally was that this notion of educating people on privacy and consent was undermined when you also had to educate them about blockchain, and that notion of the double sale was like incredibly difficult. And our philosophy has always been that this isn't the right terminology, but like blockchain's kind of like Fight Club. You don't talk about it, right? Like it's the protocol that should be happening in the back. And so nobody talks about, the protocol of the internet when they're selling their product. Where blockchain needed to go is that it needed to be that thing that was happening in an invisible way behind the scenes, powering whatever that is, whatever it is that you as a business were doing. But we also had some, debate as to whether or not you could scale, considering data and consent. The data business works on an enormous amount of scale. Can you scale privacy and blockchain together, based on some of those things that I mentioned? So I don't know. I know, Carolina, you and your team are doing a lot of stuff in the background as it relates to blockchain. Do you support that idea and thinking about how?
I support everything that you just said. Everything you said is blockchain has to be in the background, otherwise you lose your client. When we work mostly to B2B, we do not do B2C. And I also think that there's another scale issue, is how to get people to want to keep their privacy. I think legislation will actually help that. And in a lot of industries, legislation has actually spearheaded this. So that's why I think in the next year, when we're going to start looking at the new privacy laws that are coming out of Washington, and there's consensus among both the Democrats and the Republicans that that's going to be coming, this could actually help tremendously increase everybody's awareness of how they're going to use their data, and blockchain could be a very good methodology to use it. That could help that.
Yeah, I would agree with all that too. It's every quarter or so we reevaluate our sales pitch or our sales strategy and how we're talking about, what we sell at Brave. And when I took over sales 2 years ago, it was, blockchain was still pretty hot, and there was, I have this side hustle called Never Stop Marketing, and we have this Lumascape looking chart, and there are 400 companies on it that were all using the blockchain technology. Many of them have either gone away, dissolved, got, purchased by other companies. Some of them exist today, of course, on this webinar. But blockchain was a sexy term then, and Shaley can tell you he was running IAB Tech Labs and conferences on the idea of blockchain. A lot of those have disappeared, and we really went to what is the core differentiator of Brave, and we've settled the past 6 months or so on this notion of this privacy cohort of users. We call them the unreachables. And why are they unreachable? Is because they're using the Brave browser. And if they're using the Brave browser, they're not seeing your display ads. They're not seeing your YouTube ads. Only 50% of them are using Facebook often. And so if you think about all the different places, many of them are cord cutters, where all the different places where brands are running their ads, they're just not seeing them. And so what I'm trying to say is that we don't even mention the word blockchain. And we sometimes even don't talk too much about the whole notion of that 70% of the user dollars are going back into consumers' hands, because that could be misinterpreted as incentivized traffic. And then brands go, oh, is this like incentivized traffic? It's like, no. It's like a frequent flyer mile, like my American Airlines and Delta example. Just let's focus that there's these 35 million users that are unreachable that you can reach with Brave. And if someone's super smart in the room and they want to talk about blockchain, yes, we can talk about blockchain, till the cows come home. But let's just talk about the audience and how it performs in business outcomes.
Brian, Shaley, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here real quick. I mean, I think the ecosystem that we're talking about really kind of has buyers, sellers, and people. And GDPR feels like it's on one end of the extreme. It's relatively closed off, relatively hard to work with, and then this utopia of a DLT solution. Some of the stuff that Gilly's doing and others are on this other end of the spectrum that feels like it's hard to get traction and gain momentum. And I think there's going to be this middle ground where the DLT becomes the rails, but as everybody's mentioned, it's not the forefront. It's not, hey, do this because it's blockchain based. It's do this because there's other gravitational pulls that make it interesting and make it important for all three of those stakeholders: the buyers, the sellers, and the people. And that's really what we're kind of looking for solutions inside the industry. I look at kind of what some of the things Kochava is doing on working with the UID 2.0, and Shaley and team have been very instrumental in that. And we're providing 1.3 billion consented email addresses to convert them to UID 2 hashtags, so that those can be transacted on, and you're really working with consented people, right? So that's an example of a solution that gets a lot of traction, right? Now, could we come back in and make that blockchain based and make it better? Potentially, right? Those are things that we need to talk about, work with Shaley and team at IAB, and kind of push the solutions forward as we go.
Yeah, so that's what I was mentioning. Like we're taking parts of the technology, like the tokenization is happening with UID2. We had the proof of concept with the DLT for managing movement of data through privacy chain. But I also wanted to get back to the privacy question. Like there are two aspects to privacy. Like the first one is from a consumer perspective, where I just don't want to be known. Like I want everything about me private. Like I don't want other entities to know who I am, or or any other details about my existence or my being. And that's the hard one. Like you can go to Ethereum today and get a private public key and start signing things, but then also to operate in the internet, to have my presence, I also need some friendly human username. And that's, I think, what they call the Zuko's triangle. Like you need the security, you need the identity, and you need a friendly human username. And that all of that is what's not there today. Like I can get one of these or two of these, but not all three. Though, like with ENS domains and all, you can have your friendly username and sign things instead of signing with Facebook or Apple or Google. And that's something that you control and not these other entities that control. When you sign in with an email password somewhere or get a Google email or get an Apple ID, these are all controlled by other entities. So that's one aspect of privacy from a consumer perspective. And we are far from enabling that. But the second aspect is actually what all of us have talked about in the back end. Once you have any sort of identity and consent and managing that, I think that's where the DLT can really play a very good part. DLT along with tokenization. And that's what we try to do with Privacy Chain, and UID2 is doing with the tokenization of it. So that's, I think, where some strides are being made, and we can really apply the technology there.
So one question I wanted to kind of pose back to the group, because I think there's sort of two forces that we're talking about. One is on one side of the equation, you have regulation. So we would all agree that the privacy genie is out of the bottle. Every country in the world is rewriting privacy law to include the consumer. And on the other side of the extreme, you have the emergence of blockchain, which is really sort of individuals kind of taking control of privacy on their own. So in a perfect world, you as a consumer are more involved in your data. As we evolve, does regulation become redundant as blockchain continues to inflect? Because why do you need GDPR, CPRA, et cetera, if you have a protocol from which consumers can manage identity and privacy themselves? Any commentary on that from the group?
Oh, I'd love that to be a reality. That would be fantastic. I think that's a little bit of a utopia, because I think that there is some government control that's why the regulations do exist. And I think they want to have certain auditability on this, because the regulations are not just for us for advertising or how the consumer is doing certain things. It also goes to transactional based on e-commerce and dealing with know your customer and anti-money laundering ideas and a whole host of other regulations that feed into this. But I love what you just said, Neil, and it's one of the first times I've actually heard that. If that could be a reality, that it is managed really by the individual more, I think I would be all for that. That would be amazing.
And what I wonder, and feel free to comment on this, everyone, is is government regulation in blockchain on a collision course? Because inherently, blockchain is not about control from government. But yet here you have government driving regulation. And as you mentioned, Carolina, the government will want to have their hands involved in this, but the blockchain does not want the government involved. I can assure you that. So which one wins? I think inevitably they push the concept of privacy all forward, but inevitably it seems as though there's a cage match on the horizon between these two, and one of them's going to win.
I've never heard that piece, and I really love it, because that would be the real iteration on trying to make both privacy and blockchain a standard like we have with the internet. And I just love that idea. And this is one of the first times I've really heard it. So I'm very intrigued by that. That could be that. I hope so.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is that I think that you do still need the regulation for a couple of reasons. Like you have the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange and all these places where you can trade stocks, but you still need like the SEC and other government regulations to oversee it, even though it's supposed to be a fair marketplace. shenanigans can happen. And so that's where, government steps in. And I know for, the blockchain area, I think that there's a lot of very large banks that haven't fully stepped into investing in crypto, which obviously uses the blockchain, because there is a little bit of lack of regulation. And I think when regulation does come in, the market could take a hit because it's like, oh my God, it's supposed to be unregulated, it's supposed to be decentralized. Now there's just all this regulation. But I think that in the long term, that helps the crypto market a ton, because now all these big banks can say, like, I'm safe, like this is a safe and regulated way to put my money. And now I can go invest the billions instead of the millions.
Yeah, I think regulations do provide a level of safety and trust for everyone to participate into something. But like Neil said, like the ultimate vision for blockchain is that it doesn't need a regulation by its very nature. Pretty much every project is open source, so everybody can investigate what it's actually doing. And with the DLT, you can sign up as a node and have access to all the data that's out there. So at any time, everybody knows everything, and it's a whole transparent world.
Right, it's transparent. Then when something goes wrong and someone is at fault for something that's transparent, like, there kind of needs to be the cop to come in and say, it's transparent and now you need to pay a fine or whatever, because without any regulation, it's just transparent, and maybe, their name goes bad, but like there's no, retribution or whatever to say, like, it was transparent and you're fined or whatever it is.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, some regulation should be there to create the trust in the system.
I think Neil is
sorry, Caroline. I was just going to say, I kind of think that the regulatory efforts have also been an accelerant, right? A lot of this stuff probably would have come down the road at some point, but without having regulatory guidance and pushing laws and rules to do it, we would have kind of continued to kind of do it as we've always done, right? And ATT is, I think, a perfect example of that. When Apple announced it a year ago, everybody in the ad tech industry scrambled to come up with solutions that work within the new rules. And I think privacy and consent across the board are all being pushed to better solutions using better technology because of these regulations. I'm with Carolina. Like, utopia is that the regulations and the solution are redundant, that we're doing everything we're supposed to be doing, not because we have to, but because we have the technology and the solutions to do it. But I just think this is all an accelerant to make it happen much faster.
I do want to say one other thing. I don't think that that his postulate is talking about a norm that there isn't any laws. It's normative ideas that exist. People will enforce the laws themselves without having the government enforce it within the blockchain. Isn't that correct, Neil? You would actually have an incredible utopia if that were to happen.
Yeah, I take the counter argument in that regulation's not needed, because I think the market is moving to a direction where you don't need the attorney general kind of driving, privacy. I do think, I would agree with Brian in that regulation acts as training wheels, in that it kind of kickstarts the market. I think historically, if you look back at antitrust, it's the threat of antitrust drives more change than the antitrust itself. And I think that that's representative in the market today, both with the whip sign of cookies, ATT, the need for consent. In my opinion, what's happening is private enterprises and public companies are making much more of a dramatic move in relation to privacy than government regulators are. The government regulators don't have the capacity or the speed from which to stay on top of the technology. But the move of GDPR 2 years ago, the comment is like, oh, that's irrelevant, it happens in Europe. Anybody who thinks that today has clearly got their head in the sand, because the introduction of ATT from Apple, the deprecation of the cookie, the move towards compliant, the introduction of CPRA, like these are all derivatives of the threat of kind of onerous legislation. So, I think at some point or another, I think today that those two things work hand in hand. And I don't think that the industry moves without that regulation as a kickstart. But I think that once momentum gets moving and people start to understand that privacy and these moves create competitive advantage, that's when the entrepreneurs and the private enterprise kind of take over and drive things. And I think the last comment on this is that, you look at the biggest company in the world being Apple, they are leaning in, legitimizing privacy as part of their core DNA. The reciprocal impact of Apple just doing that as part of their core positioning will have an astronomical impact on every other Fortune 500 company who looks to Apple for inspiration as it, involves kind of strategy. So, to me, I think privacy becomes, not an option, but like part of the DNA of brands moving forward. And that combined with capitalism will kind of change the model. So, that's my personal opinion, but
so in a sense, you're saying like we need the regulation, but we don't need the regulators and the bureaucracy that goes along with it.
And
ultimately,
do you think, when you look at platforms like Facebook, do you think the leaders of Facebook are afraid of Elizabeth Warren, or do you think they're afraid of a coup inside of their platform that has 2.5 billion users?
Yeah.
I would argue the latter.
Yeah. I agree. I also think that the GDPR and the CPRA, it provides a common ground, a rule book or playbook to which to abide by. Maybe they don't, like I've heard that the GDPR doesn't have enough staff, regulators to go after all the things that companies are doing. So you're right, they're not regulating, but at least when someone's starting a new company or has a big company and they need to follow a certain protocol of how they should think about privacy, at least there's a framework where they know, which side is right and which side is wrong. So it does help in that sense.
It does to a certain extent, but how GDPR is done in Europe, it also can be more stringent on a country by country basis. And that creates that patchwork also of regulations within GDPR itself. And that's certain things that are difficult. And I'm hoping that in the United States that we're not going to look just at, at California with their CPRA, we are going to have a single law federally and preemptive that will make it easier for people to see one law basically to rule us all in the US.
I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet because CCPA and then CPRA have been talking about since GDPR.
I don't know, Donnie. Like I kind of think that that's going to create an absolute hot mess in the U.S. market. Like let's be clear, it's a $250 billion a year market. It's the biggest data market in the world. You have no federal privacy law. You have 50 individual states, each with a different agenda. You got a lot of companies that make a lot of money selling data. I mean, to me, the issue with not having a federal law is big data companies, they unfortunately, have the potential to be staring down the barrel of 50 individual class action lawsuits. And if you're a big company managing data and you have an inability to remain compliant, that's going to turn into a bit of a gong show. And so like, I almost think it's the structure of that state level privacy law and how crazy it is. The consequence of that is going to create chaos. And out of that chaos, you then might get this sort of federally driven kind of law. But I also come back to this idea of, well, if you're a big data company and there is no federal law, how do you remain compliant? And that's, to me, again, potentially where the blockchain and other companies and other ideas can kind of come in to say, I got to run a business. I can't manage 50.
You have to, Neil, right? I mean, the way you do it is lowest common denominator. You have to work to the most stringent laws that are out there and make it work for all of the other states or countries or regions that you're working in. And so that's why a solution, that has some sort of industry standards or some sort of federal, rules and regulations makes a ton of sense. As Carolina said, kind of, at least we know what rules we're supposed to be playing by.
I think that's an important point. I think one other thing that blockchain does, which we didn't discuss earlier, was that it codifies the whole process, or you can easily codify the regulation. So then this whole issue of being compliant and not being compliant gets reduced to a very good extent, and saves those companies from liabilities once they're on a blockchain system and everything is codified. The movement of data, the collection of consent, permissioning, all of that is going by a standard set of rules for everyone. So that helps, because data moves, right? It doesn't stay with one company. We know that data moves from one company to another. And the same set of standards, when all the companies subscribe to, then it's a lot easy in terms of managing that.
And have you heard about, I think all of you have been looking quite closely at what Maryland is doing with their taxing issue for advertising. And blockchain can do a really good job with that. And that, because there's privacy and tax merging together if that gets through federal. Because right now it's not being enforced because it's under federal litigation. And this is from March of this year. And 21 other states want to follow Maryland if that were to pass. And this is where the blockchain can work with privacy, taxation exceptionally well. And it would be a very good way of looking at general excise taxes as well as privacy concerns, because they're intermeshed in that particular legislation.
And though, how do you then, if you take that a step forward, Carolina, assume that that moves forward, how do you move that concept onto the chain to reflect the general population versus just those people who are supporting the chain today?
That's a very difficult question on this piece. But I would say that if it were enacted, that we would have to have some sort of identity chain that would be either a public-private kind of idea. We would have this intermeshing of all the different people, like Kili, like Brave, all working in some sort of unison with a private public idea, like they're doing in DC now with the cryptocurrency, that they're looking at CBDC and that kind of idea. That could work, because to try to find it, because Maryland's it's a very difficult case. It's audience based how they're trying to do the taxation on this. That is really intertwined with privacy issues. And how will companies that do programmatic be able to pay the general excise tax on a state-by-state basis if it's not intermixed into something that is like a blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's a natural kind of handoff here to, I know Shaylee, you were very deep in the construction of privacy chain a few years ago for, all of us that were in that kind of version 1 of the blockchain. Maybe kind of talk a little bit about privacy chain and kind of, was that too early? And some of the stuff that Carolina is talking about now is there a new form of privacy chain that's either currently in market or could become like a phoenix and reemerge that could solve some of the things that are being mentioned?
Yeah, I think privacy chain was a little early for reasons that the blockchain technology itself was still evolving. The second one was the regulations were also evolving at that time. Like, we didn't have any CCPA, we only had GDPR at that point. And even GDPR was in very early stages, like any law, like once it's there and then you actually see the application of it, takes like a couple of years, 3 years to kind of figure out how the regulators are actually applying the law in practical terms. But the essence of privacy chain was to standardize the capture of consent from the user, and then track the movement of data across all the parties, and then so that the consumer or the user at any time knows who is having access to their data, and they have full control over turning that on or off.
Question on that. So question on that quickly. So I think it's an important distinction, because often people think about the blockchain as the movement of data on the chain. And I think it's important that we kind of talk about that because that's its own. What you're talking about is the consent layer, not the movement of data. And I think it's a really important piece. So if you let's just make sure that we kind of dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, so there was no, on the chain, there would have been no real data. On the chain, we would only had reference that, this particular consent was transferred to from X company to Y company, that X company sold this data or gave this data to Y company. And the companies would still hold their own data in their own silos, but only references would be on the chain, so that you're not really exposing any data. And of course, like that was a proof of concept, but we had like roadmap on very advanced versions of encryption where the accessibility to data from one company to another would be turned on or off pretty easily.
Yeah, we went through that ourselves. Is that one of the challenges that we found was we talked about kind of the double sale of the blockchain, but there was this misconception amongst people in the community that data would be floating around on chain and like the capacity just
no, never. We won't put the data on the chain.
Yeah,
that would defeat the whole purpose of privacy.
Yeah,
it would only be references, and then we kind of debated a lot on that, like how would that reference be? It cannot be direct. It needs to be triangulated enough that you can track back anything from one reference to another. And shades of that you are seeing in we're developing the accountability framework now to support UID2 efforts, and you can see that similar concept on how there's reference IDs and there's a transaction ID. A lot of people misconceive this with the actual data or the actual reference, but it's not. It's just a reference of how the data is getting exchanged, and to hold those entities that have that accountable.
One thing that I did want to kind of talk about, sort of specifically about that, is this notion of consent. And people often talk about data. Our sort of opinion internally is if you're talking about data, you're too far up funnel. You should be talking about, where is it originating and where's the consent. We're of the opinion that nobody in the future buys data, they buy consent. And as a byproduct of buying consent, you can have whatever data you want. With that in mind, if we kind of zoom out, we're all in, an ad tech, martech industry. It's a huge market. In large part, that does not operate sort of specifically on one-by-one consent for the individual. The analogy that we've often used is that you look at the auto manufacturers, nobody contests that you're moving from gas-powered cars to EV. I think if you use a similar analogy, you're moving from an unconsented market with no consumer inclusion to a consented market with consumer inclusion, which means that $250 billion has got to move from one side of the ledger to the other. What are the challenges and sort of what do we think some of the challenges are associated to that? Because I know we've talked about privacy chain and consent, we talked about regulation, but do you believe that this migration is happening? And if so, what are the catalysts to accelerate it to going from that unconsented, no consumer included market to one that is driving the consumer? I know, Brian, you and the team at Kajava have got a lot of opinions on this. Any comments on this transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. There's no one size fits all for identity. I mean, look at how many identity graphs are available today, and I think that's going to be the same for consent for a while. People are going to find their own consent solutions. I love your analogy. If we're not buying data in the future, we're buying consent, and that trickles down to data from whatever consent you have. I think kind of back to my answer previously, right? It's how do you provide a solution, the rails, for buyers, sellers, and people to all understand the value proposition to come onto a common platform, right? And that's going to be the challenge. I think UID2 has some momentum. I think some of the other solutions out there have momentum because the size and scale of what they're doing. And I think they're getting some buy-in from the trust and transparency of what they're doing. And I think as multiple solutions start to emerge, we're going to see who's doing a good job of protecting the consent, who's doing a good job of auditing the consent, right? Like how much trust do all three of those stakeholders really have in the solutions? And the winners are going to be the ones that can validate that their solution works and that it does what it says it's going to do with accuracy and validity.
That makes sense. At Brave, we think about it a little bit differently in the sense that like we don't track anything about our users, so we don't really need consent to track them. We don't need to know any of their PII or any information about them. And we want the brands themselves, you know, the Kraft and Pepsis, the GMs and Fords of the world, to have that one-to-one relationship with the users and have the brands ask the users for consent to create that relationship and leave Brave kind of out of the equation. We're just bringing this unreachable, anonymized, private, you know, user base to the brands and let the brands ask for consent and have that first party data.
So
I think ultimately that is the source. Sorry, Neil, just Donnie's totally right. And I mean, you know, our solution is we think about what Kochava is doing, and you know, we're building on a solution we call Identity Locker, which is, you know, exactly what the stuff we're talking about. It's a cryptographic tokenized data, but it's really the brands and then working with various ad tech, martech partners to really find those connections, those joins, right? So the brand has amazing first party data, but they can't necessarily connect it to all of the endpoints that they want. But they've got the consented consumer level data. And so the solution is working with those brands to make sure that that consented data goes to the right endpoint in a safe, private, you know, approved way. And so I fully agree with you, Donnie. It really starts with the brand and building a solution that works for them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
we are talking about kind of the free flow of data, but we should talk about that not all data is free flowing and that it's increasingly getting walled. There's a bit of a misconception that, you know, it's an equal playing field and that all the data is in the open market. And I think we all agree that it's not. You know, with changes in the market and more data floating into the walled gardens, does this undermine the ability of the blockchain to actually gain traction? Does it undermine the ability for, you know, consumer involvement and consent? Because increasingly the majority of data that is originating in the market is coming under terms and conditions of those walled gardens and remaining in those walled gardens and not falling out of it. Any thoughts on how that impacts what we've been discussing?
I'll quickly interject that that's always been a challenge when I was investigating the space, you know, 2-3 years ago, was that you have, you know, Facebook, Amazon, Google, now, you know, newer ones like Pinterest and Instacart and all these companies, where if you look at the percentage of media dollars that are flowing, the high majority are going through those companies. Something, whatever, the latest number is 70-90%. And hardly any of those companies are using blockchain technology. I mean, Facebook was going to roll out, you know, a coin a while ago that kind of died on the vine. But they're not using the blockchain technology. So now we're talking about, you know, this smaller sliver of the pie that really wants to use the blockchain technology for everything. And is that enough user base or enough media dollars to really create momentum in the space? And that's yet to be seen, but it's hard to prove out when the walled gardens have so much control.
Yeah, and
yeah, more than walled gardens, I would say like it's a first party is becoming more and more important as privacy regulations and consent and managing that and compliance becomes more important, because naturally they have more control over what they're doing and they can guarantee much better compliance. That does leave a gap, especially like most worried about journalism and news media. I think it leaves a big gap there in blockchain, like what Neil talked about, like managing consent or buying consent. with a blockchain supported system that's robust, I think can provide the fill in the gaps there.
To add complexity to this, ATT comes out when asked if you want to be tracked. We can debate the number. The majority say no, but yet the entire data industry relies on being tracked. So when given a protocol that allows you to choose to be tracked, does that pull the plug on the ability for brands, platforms, et cetera, to have access to data that they need in order to run their solution? Because it seems inherently contradictory. In one sense, when asked, consumers don't want to be tracked, but yet the entire $250 billion market runs on data that is currently not asking the user to be tracked. These two seem to be on a collision course that when you put them together, if 90% of people opt out, what happens then?
Yeah, I mean, it's a conundrum. I mean, I think if you look at the ATT also, they're mainly worried about cross-site tracking and mixing data from across sites for profiling people. I mean, even if I say no to ATT, I mean, that particular, I still have the IDFV. I can still track my own users. I can do everything. It doesn't stop you from doing any of that. Or if I have multiple websites that I own, then I can track people across those, even with ATT. So even after ATT, you still need some sort of consent on what kind of permissioning, what kind of tracking you can and cannot do. So that still exists. It's just that the cross-site tracking through made it a lot easier to build these profiles beyond the first-party walls. That is going to get affected.
I think our research is suggesting, I think there's a bit of a misconception that consumers are not willing to share data. I think that that's proven to be not the case. They are. I think where there is an inflection point is when the consumers turned into a CDO, and the initial the initial relationship between me as a consumer and the publisher, the application, the browser turns into a perpetual arbitrage and out the back door. I think that's what ATT has actually, kind of uncovered, is that I agree with you. I mean, the whole world is pivoting to first-party data. First-party data is just another word for one-by-one consent, right? So it just sort of, to me, it means that if you're a secondary or a third, down the line relationship, consumers definitely don't want that because it's opaque and there's no way for you to remain compliant with the existing regulation. That to me is kind of what ATT has shown in the market. I don't know, Brian. I mean, you have a lot of exposure to the mobile world at Kochava. I'm sure you guys have an opinion on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what you guys have said, right? I mean, it is all about first-party data, and it is one-on-one consent. Back to the previous conversation, one of the things that we've really emphasized is working with our brands to try to create that kind of education moment where this is why you want to get consent with your users, right? This is important, so you have this data, so you can continue to do the thing, connect the dots, downstream across sites, across media spend platforms, to really try to have a holistic view of, how effective are your ad dollars? How engaged are your users? What's driving further engagement and lifetime value? So that's what we're seeing.
And is this, again, part of that? I'm reluctant to use the word incentive, but like, is this where that conversation becomes, what's the value prop for me as a consumer as it relates to data? I mean, I think we all understand, the principles of privacy by design, which is about minimizing, kind of data collection. I don't think that that's necessarily being reflected in the market where we maximize data collection. But that trade-off, which is I want access to free content, therefore I'm willing to give you data. But, in these other situations, is this where some sort of trade, whether it's a token like that or something else, can kind of help open up that percentage of the consumer that is basically saying, look, unless you're giving me some value in return, not the one-to-one relationship that I have on the publisher, that's clear return, then I'm not willing to share data. But, you know, Donnie, maybe you're the best person to speak to that. And I apologize for using the word incentive because I know you hate that word, but.
Well, I have, you know, it's like two answers talking out of both sides of my mouth. So one of the things that we do is when brands run these sponsored image homepage takeover type units, we run a brand survey right before the day and then right after the day. And we use our push notifications to ask users if they're aware of the brand or aware of the promotion, and then ask the same questions after. And we'll put these surveys up for like 2, 3, or 4 hours, and we'll get like 1,000 responses like that. And I don't know if consumers are thinking that they're making more money, more BAT when they're filling out these surveys, but they're not. And we don't say anywhere that they are. And we get tons of responses. And there's a lot of, you know, it's less, you know, name, but it's age, income, where they live, you know, and then brand preferences that are going to the survey. My point is that people are willing to fill out these surveys and not get compensated. On the flip side of it is that these privacy conscious consumers do feel or are learning over time that they're not the product and that their data has value to it. And not only that their data has value to it, but their attention, their time, their eyeballs, that also has a value to it. And so we start with giving compensation anywhere from like $5 to $10 a month for the attention, for the eyeball. But, you know, Neil, you and I have had a lot of discussions about how do you convert that into, all right, I'm making $5 to $10 a month from seeing ads. How do I make an extra $5 to $10 a month on top of that by sharing that data and letting it be used? Because I'm happy to tell everybody that I'm a dad with 3 kids living in Connecticut.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece. You know, I think the stat that you mentioned at the beginning where, you know, 70% of Brave users are, you know, are trading in tokens. Well, that means not everybody is there to make money. You know, so that's the one thing it jumps out at me is, yes, you know, some people want, you know, an incentive, you know, as being part of the Brave ecosystem, but then there's clearly a percentage that don't. And I think that this is something that I struggle with quite a bit, which is, you know, when we launched this product initially and we kind of came out of the gate, it was data equals money. And it's not true, right? Like in one sense, it's correct. And, you know, there's different estimates that, you know, as a consumer, your data is worth, when rolled up, $6,000 per year. But there's a large percentage of people that don't want to sell their data. You know, there's a huge percentage, there's a percentage of people that do, and there's a percentage of people that don't. And that, you know, if your product is entirely dependent upon kind of the selling of data, then you're kind of bifurcating the market. You know, you're saying like, oh, these are the people that are in the product and these are the people that are not. You know, I think as time has kind of increasingly gone on, what we've discovered is that, yeah, of course, the option of compensation should be on the table. But it is not an all or nothing kind of opportunity. I think that just using that rough statistic would suggest there's people that come to Brave today that don't care about the compensation. They care about the privacy. And yet, I think you would agree that there's people that come to the product today that are in the product because of the compensation. And there's probably a third group that are in it for both. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of how we look at the Kill ecosystem too, is that there's a very primal linear thought process, which is, you know, my data is getting sold. I want some, give me some. But then you're in this situation, which is, you know, how much money can I make? And the point is like, well, look, your data is already being collected and sold. You're not involved. This is about kind of getting you involved. I think as time has gone on, what we've sort of realized is providing the optionality to the consumer is sort of, you know, really the core. And that if they choose to sell that data, let them. If they choose to not, fine. But I think, you know, that optionality is something that's never really kind of existed really in the market. And I think it's clearly present in Brave. It's increasingly present in the Kill ecosystem. And I think that that's going to be increasingly present if you move to the blockchain, because it's a choice. Do you want to give up this data? Yes or no? And if you do, what's the value prop? Today, there's no explanation of the value prop. The data is being collected and sold regardless of whether or not you'd want to do it or not. And I think some of these things like ATT and others would suggest that, that clearly doesn't align with the way in which the consumer is kind of thinking. So
it's so true. Like every single website has like hit OK to accept cookies. I mean, in a perfect world, it's like hit OK to be compensated to accept these cookies and to give up your data or whatever it is. And this is the estimated earnings, and this is how it works. And versus just this like yes or no thing. And there's no reason to accept the cookies. There's no
that's just bad
incentive.
product. Like that's just unimaginative product development. Like,
yeah.
like that's like, if you think that that's going to last, like you're a dinosaur. I mean, there's just no
Right.
way that this giant banner on the bottom where you're hoping nobody reads it is the way to kind of manage consumer involvement in UX. That's just a very antiquated way of kind of thinking about product. And the companies that continue to embrace that are going to get crushed. And the companies that embrace consumer involvement in the UX part of the equation are going to be the ones that are going to inflect. So, I mean, I laugh every time I see that. I'm like, who's the product guy that came up with this idea? It's terrible. It's just my own personal pet peeve about that giant banner overtake. But anyway, I'm conscious of everybody's time. Everybody's super busy. Just before we kind of quickly wrap up here, let's just quickly kind of go around, starting with Carolina, specifically around any final thoughts regarding kind of privacy and blockchain, and that you want to just make sure that the audience digest before we bounce. And while we're going through this, I'd encourage anybody in the audience, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please put them in. And if not, we'll wrap up within the next 5 minutes or so.
I think that blockchain is definitely going to be something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about next year when there are certain privacy laws that are going to be passed. And I think the compliance and auditability of how the data is used is going to be, and I'm not talking about movement of data, it is used, will be something that we're going to be looking into quite heavily. And I think that the compliance that blockchain provides for that and that sort of methodology of auditability could be something that is going to spur on our industry or for this in the future.
Awesome. And just before we move over to Brian, for those people that want to learn more about what NIAX is doing and how to get in touch with you, is there a place that you'd like to direct them to?
They can come right to our website on niax.com, or I can give you my email and they can email me directly. I have no problem with that.
Okay, awesome. Brian, any final thoughts? And make sure you alert the audience as to how they can get in touch with you if they want to learn more about what you're working on at Kochava.
Yeah, perfect. So I totally agree with Caroline. I think blockchain and distributed ledger technology is going to be more and more prevalent. I just wanted to kind of add one more log onto the fire. We've been talking appropriately so about privacy and consent, but the other elephant in the room for ad tech, martech is fraud. And what happens in today's current ecosystem, and what DLT can do as a really slick, innovative solution for managing fraud and other things. And that's some of the stuff that Kochava is working on. So happy to kind of dive deeper into that. If anybody wants, you can find us at kochava.com or reach out to me directly, LinkedIn or email.
Yeah, it's our belief that every issue that you have as it relates to fraud today is a byproduct of the disintermediation of the consumer from data. And if you didn't do that in the first place, fraud, fidelity, transparency, and compliance wouldn't be topics that we'd be discussing today. But that's for probably our next webinar. We can discuss that. Donnie, just final thoughts from you and where people can learn more about you and Brave.
Yeah, I think something that we talked about in our pre-call that I should mention is like what's changed from 3 years ago to today as it relates to blockchain and advertising. And I think 3 years ago, companies were being founded and ideas were coming up because blockchain was this hot fad. And so we were trying to throw blockchain on everything. And now we're moving over to today where people are having a really strong holistic look at all the different options of how to, have a solution to the challenge. And if blockchain is absolutely the best way to do it, and from Brian's angle, from Carolina's angle, from Shaylee's angle, they've done that investigation. Blockchain is the best way to do it, then blockchain should be the way to go. But if there's another technology out there that's better for various reasons, then blockchain shouldn't be used.
Yeah, and it's funny, again, for some of us who went through that original crypto winter, my comment around that was, this is the best thing that's ever happened to the blockchain, because everybody that was involved in the blockchain, 4 or 5 years ago, doesn't have this big light being shone on them. And all those people are still in the blockchain. I can assure you that. And they've been quietly working on very good, very smart, very intellectual kind of businesses. So that version 2 of the blockchain, which is sort of what we're experiencing today, is a direct byproduct of that kind of meltdown that we had sort of 4 or 5 years ago. And nothing's ever a straight line, but the initial that initial growth of the chain brought lots of smart people into this ecosystem. A lot of them got their, hand slapped when things crashed, but a lot of them kind of learned a lot from that crash and have been continuing to tinker in the space. And, I've always thought that since that crash is like the next great kind of companies will come out of, this crash, because they'll have made some capital, they've learned a lot, and now they can kind of quietly just work on their craft without, people kind of pressing on them. So I agree. Shaylee.
And let me just tell them how they can reach me, and then we'll go to Shaylee.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So 3 things. Go to brave.com and download the browser on all your devices and start using it. And it's really easy to import your bookmarks and your extensions and set it as your default browser. You won't be unhappy with that decision. And commit to using it as your default browser for at least a week, and you'll never go back to any other browser. And then I'm at Donny, DONNY at brave.com, or if you're an advertiser interested in Brave, you can email ad sales at brave.com, and that's the best way to contact us. And sorry, Shaylee, now go ahead.
No, I can vouch for that. I've been pretty happy with the Brave browser. On my phone, I use it less on the desktop because I've got so much other setup on the big Chrome thing. But on my phone, I'm always using the Brave browser.
Nice.
It's been for almost 2 years now.
Any final thoughts, Shaylee, and where people can
I think
IB?
Yeah, I think the technology is what they call in the technology adoption life cycle. I think it's in the process of crossing the shelves. Like if you see even if you compare with the internet, right? It had a big meltdown in 2000, and then it came back much stronger, much better applications and much better usage. I think the same thing's going to happen here. The technology is well established. It's well proven in many areas, especially finance. It's now very popular. It's a household name. Like every kid, every grandma knows there's something called cryptocurrency. So all of that adds to the education and openness of people to adopt it when that happens, which is happening now. So I'm pretty hopeful that people will adopt it because it does solve a lot of the problems, especially in our industry where so many companies are collaborating together to make one transaction happen. I think the DLT plays a very important role. And we've seen like in our own industry, like, you're using it, Brave's using it, Brian's here from Kochava, another company, Lucidity that's still using it, a couple other companies. And we have a very interesting project with TAG going on in UK and the DLT project where they've successfully done transactions and proven a lot of the concepts in the overall programmatic space. So a lot is happening, and I'm very hopeful.
Great. And so just to kind of wrap up, again, I'm Neil Sweeney. You can find me on the regular channels, although don't go to a lot of the commercial social channels. I'm not on those, but you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter. You can email directly at neil@kili.io. We'd encourage you to go to Kili and see what data is out there on you. It'll be shocking for some of you, I'm sure. I just like to say thanks to everybody that that did give their time. Lots of great conversations. I'm hoping I can encourage you to maybe do a version 2 of this at some point in the future to see how we've progressed with blockchain. I just say that the emergence of new protocols always has an impact on those companies that are dominant today. And, I'm not a big believer in monopolies. I think they're an artificial concept. I'm a big believer in technology and entrepreneurship, and that monopolies tend to get slow. And so I think the combination of innovation plus the emergence of a protocol like the blockchain, that's what the next great companies are going to be built on. And hopefully it's some of these companies that are on this call today. So thanks, everybody. If you want a copy of the recording or you want to view the recording, it will be up on our website, and stay tuned for the next installment of the Kili webinar series. Thanks, everybody, for your time.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
His name.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, guys.